Ava Carter boarded the flight with the kind of calm confidence that often went unnoticed by those around her. Dressed in a sleek dress with a tailored blazer, her natural curls framed her face, and in one hand she held a leather laptop bag while the other gripped her boarding pass. As she walked down the aisle of the plane, she glanced at the seat numbers, making her way to her assigned spot in the first-class section. Despite the occasional curious glances from passengers, Ava remained focused on her task at hand. She stored her bag in the overhead compartment, sat down, and began jotting down some notes in a small notebook. Her demeanor was steady and composed, showing no sign of the nerves or excitement that often accompanied air travel. Miranda Scott, a flight attendant, walked briskly through the cabin. With her sharp uniform and even sharper gaze, she seemed to inspect each passenger carefully as she passed. When her eyes landed on Ava, something about her caught Miranda's attention. It wasn't immediately clear what, but she paused, her expression tightening. She walked closer to Ava's seat. "Excuse me," Miranda said in a polite but somewhat cold tone. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Ava looked up, surprised but unfazed. She handed over the boarding pass with a small smile. "Of course," she replied. Miranda scanned the ticket, her frown deepening as she processed the information. "This is for first class?" she asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. "Yes," Ava replied simply, her voice steady. Miranda paused, her lips pressed into a tight line as she handed the boarding pass back. Without saying another word, she walked away, but the tension on her face was palpable. Something about Ava had unsettled her, and she wasn't done yet. Ava, meanwhile, shrugged off the brief interaction, returning to her notes. She didn't notice Miranda speaking quietly with another flight attendant near the galley, casting suspicious glances back in her direction. It wasn't long before Miranda returned, this time with a more authoritative air. She approached Ava again, her stance more rigid. "Miss Carter," Miranda said, her tone sharper now, "could you step aside for a moment? I need to verify something." Ava blinked, surprised but calm. She stood, gathering her laptop bag, and followed Miranda toward the galley, all while passengers in first class exchanged curious looks and whispered amongst themselves. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to a different seat," Miranda said, her arms folded across her chest. "It seems there may have been a mistake with your booking." Ava tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowing in confusion. "A mistake? I don't think so. I booked this ticket weeks ago and it was confirmed. Could you double-check?" Miranda's tone turned colder. "I already checked," she said. "I don't think this seat is appropriate for you. I'll have to ask you to take a seat in the main cabin." Ava's expression shifted ever so slightly, disbelief flashing across her face, but she quickly regained her composure. "I don't understand. My ticket is valid. Why would I need to move?" Miranda stiffened, her voice dropping to a harsher whisper. "I don't have time to explain. Either you move or I'll have to call security." For the first time, Ava's gaze hardened. She narrowed her eyes but then nodded once, quietly agreeing to move. She returned to her seat, gathered her belongings, and stood, making her way toward the back of the plane, escorted by Miranda. The murmurs of the passengers grew louder as Ava walked, and despite her poise, her grip on her laptop bag tightened slightly. When they reached the main cabin, Miranda gestured to an empty seat in the middle row. Ava placed her bag under the seat and sat down. Not a word spoken. She stared out the window, her face calm, though clearly agitated. Her thoughts raced, somewhere between frustration and disbelief, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she pulled out her phone and quickly typed a message. When she hit send, a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips, but she made sure no one saw it. Back in first class, Miranda went about her duties, checking on other passengers and flashing polite smiles. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the whole interaction. There was an unsettling calmness about Ava that she didn't fully understand. The flight continued, but Ava's mind was already set in motion. She was someone who preferred precision over chaos. The tension between her and Miranda, though subtle, was the beginning of something far more significant than either of them knew. As the flight progressed, the events that would follow seemed inevitable, but no one could have predicted the consequences that would unfold. Not just for the passengers on board, but for the airline itself. Ava remained calm throughout the flight, even though her mind was far from peaceful. She sat quietly in her seat, observing the hum of the plane and the occasional glance of curiosity from the passengers around her. Despite the discomfort of being moved to a cramped seat in the main cabin, Ava's demeanor was unshaken. Her grip on the situation was strong, and she knew this was only the beginning of what she had planned. Miranda, on the other hand, was struggling. As the flight continued, her unease grew with every passing minute. She went through the motions, serving drinks, checking on passengers, and trying to maintain her usual professional composure. But her mind kept drifting back to Ava. The more she thought about the situation, the more unsettled she became. Something wasn't right. Miranda couldn't shake the feeling that Ava was more than just a first-class passenger. She was someone important, someone who had power beyond what Miranda could understand. Meanwhile, Ava's phone buzzed in her lap, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced down and quickly typed a message. A small, knowing smile tugged at the corners of her lips. She wasn't just sitting back and letting the situation play out. She was orchestrating it. In the main cabin, Clara, the younger flight attendant, approached Ava once again. Unlike Miranda, Clara had a gentle demeanor, and she seemed more attuned to the discomfort of passengers. She held a cup of water in her hand, offering it to Ava with a soft smile. "Ma'am, is everything okay?" Clara asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. Ava looked up, her face softening. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, her tone warm. "Just a bit of a mix-up, I suppose." Clara hesitated, sensing there was more to the story, but Ava's composed demeanor dissuaded her from asking further questions. "Let me know if you need anything else," Clara said kindly, setting the water down on Ava's tray. "Thank you, Clara," Ava replied with a sincere smile. "I appreciate your kindness." As Clara walked away, Ava allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. Despite the awkwardness of the situation, she was in control. Miranda may have thought she had gotten the upper hand by moving Ava to the back of the plane, but Ava knew better. She had already set her plan into motion, and the consequences of Miranda's actions would ripple far beyond this flight. In the first-class cabin, Miranda continued her rounds, checking on passengers and keeping up with her duties. But her thoughts were never far from Ava. Every time she passed by, she couldn't help but glance at the calm, composed woman in the main cabin. Something about her made Miranda feel uneasy, as though she were missing something important. Miranda tried to brush off her discomfort, but it lingered. The earlier phone call from the executive office had only heightened her anxiety. She couldn't understand why this incident was causing such a stir. After all, she had been just doing her job, ensuring that passengers were seated according to their ticket class. But she couldn't escape the nagging thought that she had made a grave mistake. As the flight continued, Ava sat back in her seat, flipping through her notebook and making occasional notes. She had already prepared for the fallout of this incident, but she wasn't just thinking about her own situation. She was thinking about the bigger picture. She had seen too many instances of prejudice in her life, and today was no different. It wasn't just about her. It was about creating a shift in the way people viewed those who didn't fit a certain mold. Ava glanced at her watch, then looked out the window at the passing clouds. Her fingers tapped rhythmically on the armrest, betraying her anticipation. She was waiting for something that would signal the next step in her plan. The plane was still cruising at 30,000 feet, but in her mind, Ava had already landed. The wheels were in motion, and there was no turning back. Just then, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, a routine announcement that the flight was progressing smoothly. But for Miranda, the sound of the captain's voice only added to her growing unease. Her earlier conversation with Dennis replayed in her mind. First class isn't for amateurs. People like that don't let things slide. Dennis's words had shaken her more than she cared to admit. What had she gotten herself into? Meanwhile, Ava's phone buzzed again. She glanced down at the screen, her expression unreadable. She typed a quick message, her fingers moving swiftly. "All set. They're monitoring." She hit send and slipped the phone back into her bag. Her calmness was unnerving, almost as if she knew exactly how this was going to play out. Back in the galley, Miranda was busy preparing drinks for the passengers, trying to keep her mind occupied. But no matter how hard she tried, her thoughts kept drifting back to Ava. She could feel her anxiety building. She had a nagging suspicion that something was going to happen, and soon. Dennis, noticing her restlessness, approached her once again. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone casual but with a hint of concern. Miranda stiffened, forcing a smile. "Fine," she said quickly. "Just trying to keep things moving." Dennis raised an eyebrow, but didn't push further. He could tell something was off, but he also knew better than to pry too much. Meanwhile, Ava was still sitting in the main cabin, her expression calm and composed. She had been watching Miranda, sensing the growing tension. It wasn't hard to see that Miranda was unraveling under the pressure, and Ava couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. She knew she had made the right choice by remaining calm, because in doing so, she was forcing Miranda to face the consequences of her actions. Just when Miranda thought she couldn't take the tension anymore, the in-flight phone in the galley buzzed again. Dennis picked it up, his expression neutral as he listened. A moment later, his brow furrowed, and he glanced at Miranda with a mix of curiosity and concern. "It's for you," Dennis said, handing her the phone. Miranda's stomach dropped. She hesitated before taking the receiver. "This is Miranda," she said cautiously. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "This is the airline executive office. We've received a direct complaint about an incident involving a first-class passenger. We need you to provide a detailed report upon landing. For now, ensure all passengers are treated respectfully and refrain from further altering seating arrangements without proper justification." Miranda's face paled. She felt the weight of the words sink in. "Yes, of course," she stammered, her mind racing. "I'll make sure everything is handled appropriately." As she hung up the phone, her hand trembled slightly. She glanced at Dennis, who was watching her closely. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a silent warning. For the first time, Miranda felt the weight of her actions. Ava, meanwhile, sat quietly in her seat, her mind already focused on what was to come. The storm had begun, but Miranda had no idea just how much it was about to change. As the plane continued its journey, the tension in the cabin was almost palpable. Ava, still seated in the main cabin, had returned to her calm composure, though her mind was far from relaxed. She had played her cards well so far, but she knew this was only the beginning. Miranda's mistake had set the stage for something larger, and Ava was fully aware of the consequences of her actions. Miranda, on the other hand, was struggling to keep up appearances. Her nerves were fraying, and her thoughts kept racing back to the incident with Ava. The nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach grew with each passing minute. She tried to busy herself with routine tasks, checking on passengers and distributing drinks, but her mind was elsewhere. Every time she looked toward the back of the plane, she saw Ava sitting calmly, her poised demeanor now a stark contrast to Miranda's own unease. It wasn't long before Miranda was back in the galley, trying to regain her composure. She was trying to keep herself busy, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to concentrate. Her thoughts were on the phone call from the executive office and the growing unease in her chest. There was something about Ava that unsettled her, something that made her feel like she was in over her head. Dennis, noticing Miranda's struggle, approached her once again. He leaned against the counter, his gaze steady but full of concern. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his voice low enough so no one else could hear. Miranda stiffened, forcing a smile. "Yeah," she said, though the tightness in her voice betrayed her. "Just trying to stay on top of things." Dennis didn't seem convinced. He knew Miranda well enough to see that something was wrong. "You don't look fine," he said, his tone softer now. "What's really going on?" Miranda hesitated, biting her lip. She glanced back toward the main cabin, her gaze lingering on Ava. For a moment, she felt a deep sense of uncertainty. What had she gotten herself into? "I made a mistake," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I moved her to economy without checking the ticket. I don't know. She didn't seem like she belonged there." Dennis's expression hardened slightly. "You didn't check her ticket?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Miranda shook her head, feeling the weight of her actions. "I didn't. I just assumed. I didn't think she would be a first-class passenger. She didn't look the part." Dennis let out a long sigh, crossing his arms. "That's not how this works, Miranda. You can't make assumptions like that. First-class passengers have valid tickets just like anyone else, and you never know who you're dealing with. You've crossed the line, and you could be in real trouble. Miranda's stomach dropped. She knew he was right, but it was too late now. She had acted on her own judgment, and now she had to deal with the consequences. Her eyes flicked back to Ava, who was still sitting calmly in her seat. How could someone so composed be the cause of all this chaos? Miranda's thoughts were interrupted by another phone call from the galley, and Dennis gave her a final knowing look before walking away. She grabbed the phone, her heart racing as she picked it up. "This is Miranda," she said, her voice strained. The voice on the other end was cold, authoritative. "Miranda, we need to speak with you after the flight. We've received further complaints from passengers, and the situation with Miss Carter has escalated. We will be conducting a full investigation into your actions. You will need to provide a report when we land." Miranda felt the color drain from her face. This was worse than she had imagined. The implications of the call were clear. This wasn't just about a simple mistake. It was becoming a serious matter. "Understood," she managed to say, her voice shaky. The line went dead, and Miranda stood there for a moment, the phone still pressed to her ear, her mind spinning. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of the situation crashing down on her. There was no way out now. She had made her decision, and now she had to face the consequences. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, Ava was unfazed. She continued writing in her notebook, her calm exterior hiding the strategic thinking that was unfolding inside her mind. She had been planning this moment long before the flight had even started. Her goal wasn't to punish Miranda, it was to create accountability, to force the airline to confront the systemic issues that allowed incidents like this to happen. She glanced at her watch, a faint smile curling on her lips. Everything was falling into place, and she was in control. But she wasn't finished yet. The flight continued on, and the minutes ticked by. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin, and Ava remained focused on her task. She knew that Miranda would be facing a reckoning soon, and she wasn't going to let the opportunity slip by. The tension in the air was thick, and even the passengers in the main cabin could feel it. Some cast sympathetic glances toward Ava, while others quickly looked away, not wanting to get involved. But Ava ignored them all. She had one goal, and that was to make sure the airline learned from this mistake. Just before the plane began its descent, the intercom crackled again, and the captain's voice echoed through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your trays are in their upright positions. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." As the plane began its descent, the quiet tension in the cabin seemed to grow. Miranda's nerves were at their breaking point. She glanced over at Ava one last time, but this time, their eyes met briefly. Ava's gaze was steady, unflinching, a quiet acknowledgement that Miranda's actions hadn't gone unnoticed, and they would not go unaddressed. Miranda's stomach churned as she tried to focus on her duties. She knew what was coming. The realization of her mistake was sinking in, and no amount of professional poise could shield her from the storm that was about to hit. As the plane touched down, the familiar routine of passengers unbuckling their seatbelts and retrieving their bags began. The air seemed heavier for Miranda, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something major was on the horizon. When the plane finally landed, the crew began their usual post-flight duties. But Miranda knew her day wasn't over. The call from the executive office, the investigation, she would have to face the music soon enough. But as she made her way toward the galley, trying to compose herself, she couldn't help but glance one last time at Ava. The woman was still sitting calmly, her every movement deliberate and composed. Ava stood up from her seat as the aisle cleared. She gathered her things slowly, taking her time. Miranda stood frozen at the back of the plane, watching her with a mixture of dread and admiration. Ava passed by Miranda without a word, but her calm, unwavering presence seemed to hang in the air, like an unspoken declaration. She wasn't angry, she wasn't frustrated. She was simply in control. As Ava stepped off the plane, Miranda stood at the doorway, staring after her, knowing that her actions were about to come back to haunt her in ways she could never have imagined. The door closed behind Ava as she exited the plane, and Miranda could already feel the weight of the storm that was about to hit. The moment Ava stepped off the plane, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. The ordeal was not over, but it had taken its first crucial steps toward resolution. Her calm demeanor had not been a facade. It was a strategy. As she made her way through the terminal, her mind was focused on the next phase of the plan, one that would not only hold the airline accountable for its actions, but spark change within an entire system. Miranda, meanwhile, was left behind on the plane, frozen in the doorway as the final passengers disembarked. Her mind raced, replaying the events over and over, the discomfort of the morning, and the escalating tension with every second that passed. She had thought she could handle it, that the incident with Ava would be a minor misstep that would blow over. But as the final whistle of her internal alarm sounded, she realized that nothing would ever be the same again. In the sterile conference room at the airport, Miranda sat alone, the silence pressing down on her like an invisible weight. She had expected the call, but the reality of what was happening hit her with full force. The airline had requested a full report on the incident, and the warning had come straight from the executive office. They had already started looking into her actions. There was no denying that this was bigger than a simple misunderstanding. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching the room. Miranda's stomach lurched. She looked up, seeing two uniformed security officers standing at the door. They stepped inside without a word and stood by the door as one of them spoke, his voice firm. "Miranda Scott?" the officer asked. She nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, that's me." "We need you to come with us," the officer continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We've been asked to take you to the executive office. There are questions regarding your actions on the flight." Miranda's heart pounded in her chest. She stood up, her knees weak, and followed the officers down the hallway. The gravity of the situation settled heavily in her chest as she was escorted through the terminal. She couldn't help but wonder how it had come to this, how one small decision had snowballed into a full-scale investigation that threatened to unravel everything she had worked for. Meanwhile, Ava had already left the airport, her sleek black sedan pulling smoothly away from the terminal. She sat back in the seat, her eyes staring out the window, deep in thought. The ride to her office was brief, but in those few moments, she allowed herself to reflect on everything that had happened. She wasn't naive. She knew that her actions had consequences, but those consequences were necessary. Change didn't come without discomfort, and she had done what needed to be done. The complaints she had filed, the conversations she had initiated, all of it was leading to something bigger than herself. She wasn't looking for revenge or petty payback. She wanted systemic change, something that would ripple out beyond her own experience and affect the way the airline operated for good. Back at the airport, Miranda's path was taking an entirely different direction. She was escorted to a small room where the airline executives were waiting. The air in the room felt cold, professional, but there was no denying the underlying tension. Her heart raced as she stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a finality that made her feel as though she were walking into a storm she wasn't ready to face. A panel of 3 senior airline executives sat at a large table, their eyes focused on her as she stood in front of them. One of the executives, a woman with sharp features and an air of authority, spoke first. "Miranda Scott," she began, her tone crisp, "we are here to discuss the incident that occurred on Flight 287 and the actions you took regarding Miss Ava Carter. We need your full account of what happened." Miranda swallowed hard, her palms beginning to sweat as she tried to compose herself. "I understand," she said, her voice weak. She glanced at the panel but quickly looked away, feeling the weight of their gaze. The panel began asking her questions, going over every detail of the flight. The incident with Ava was dissected, analyzed, and examined from every angle. Miranda tried to explain her actions, but each word felt hollow. She admitted that she had moved Ava without checking her ticket first, relying on her own assumptions instead of protocol. "I thought she didn't belong in first class," Miranda said, her voice faltering as she spoke. "She didn't seem like she belonged there. I thought it was a mistake." The sharp-featured executive raised an eyebrow. "A mistake," she repeated. "According to our records, Miss Carter presented a valid first-class ticket. Did you verify this before asking her to move?" Miranda hesitated. "No," she said quietly, feeling the weight of her admission sink in. "I didn't. I just assumed." The room fell silent for a moment, the gravity of Miranda's words hanging in the air. The executive continued, her voice firm. Assumptions are not a valid reason for moving someone, especially when their ticket is legitimate. You have violated the airline's policies, and as a result, the company's reputation has been jeopardized. Do you understand the severity of this situation? Miranda's throat tightened as she nodded. Yes, I understand. The questioning continued for what felt like hours. Each question chipped away at her defenses, revealing more about the choices she had made and the reasoning behind them. She couldn't deny it anymore. Her actions were rooted in bias, and she had paid the price for it. When the hearing finally concluded, Miranda was left alone in the room to gather her thoughts. Her head was spinning, and she could feel the weight of the suspension bearing down on her. She knew the next steps. An official report would be filed, and disciplinary actions would follow. The outcome was already clear in her mind. She was finished. As the door opened and the executives filed out, the panel chairwoman paused briefly. "We'll send you the details of the next steps," she said. "You will be suspended from duty until the investigation is completed. You'll be hearing from Human Resources soon." Miranda nodded, the finality of the words settling in her stomach like a stone. The door closed behind her, and she was left alone in the small, cold room. For the first time, she felt completely exposed. She had made a snap judgment based on assumptions, and now she was facing the consequences. As she walked back to her car, Miranda's mind kept drifting back to Ava. She had underestimated her from the beginning. Ava wasn't just a passenger. She was someone with power and influence, someone who had seen right through Miranda's actions. Ava hadn't retaliated out of malice. No, she had done what needed to be done. She had held Miranda accountable, and in doing so, had forced the airline to confront its deep-rooted issues. Miranda's phone buzzed in her pocket and she pulled it out. It was a message from the airline's HR department, notifying her that a disciplinary hearing had been scheduled for the following morning. The words blurred in her vision as she read them, but there was no escaping the harsh truth. Her career at the airline was over. Meanwhile, Ava sat in her office, reviewing the documents and responses she had received from the airline board. Her actions were already starting to create ripples of change. The mandatory sensitivity training, the revised complaint handling procedures, all of it was a direct result of her standing her ground. As the evening wore on, Ava received another update from her assistant, Maya. "Miranda Scott has been officially terminated," Maya said. "The board has made their decision." Ava set the phone down, her expression unreadable. She didn't feel joy or satisfaction from Miranda's downfall. This wasn't about personal victory, but it was a step in the right direction. Accountability had been established, and change was beginning to take root. Ava leaned back in her chair, her mind focused on the larger picture. This wasn't just about the airline or even about Miranda. It was about creating lasting change, making sure that this kind of bias, this kind of mistreatment, would never happen again. And though the road ahead was still long, Ava knew that she had started something that would have an impact far beyond this flight. She took a deep breath, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over her. The battle wasn't over yet, but it had begun, and with it, the possibility of something greater than herself. In the days that followed, the ripples of the incident on Flight 287 began to spread across the airline industry. The investigation into Miranda Scott's actions was swift and unforgiving, culminating in her formal termination from the airline. The decision sent shockwaves through the company, and it was clear that the board was determined to make an example of her. But Ava Carter was not focused on Miranda's downfall. She was focused on the bigger picture. The changes she had pushed for were only the beginning, and she knew there was more work to be done. As the airline began to implement its new policies and training programs, Ava received frequent updates. The company had rolled out mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all its staff, a move that was being closely watched by industry leaders. Ava had made it clear that this was only the first step, and that the airline needed to prove it was serious about addressing the root causes of the discrimination that had led to the incident. She had spent hours on the phone with various department heads, making sure that the new measures were being put in place properly. She wasn't just advocating for change, she was ensuring it. The ripple effect of the changes was being felt not just within the airline, but throughout the entire aviation industry. Other airlines had begun reaching out to her, asking for advice on how to implement similar reforms. Some of them even requested her guidance in reshaping their own training programs. Ava wasn't interested in becoming an industry consultant, but she knew the influence she had gained could be used for something bigger. She wanted to make sure that the lessons learned from her experience didn't fade into obscurity. She wanted this moment to be a turning point for the entire industry, a moment when the culture of bias and prejudice was challenged head-on. Meanwhile, Miranda had been left to pick up the pieces of her shattered career. After her termination, she spent the next few days in a daze, trying to process the events that had unfolded. The phone calls from friends and family came in waves, offering sympathy, but also judgment. She couldn't escape the shame of what had happened. She had been a flight attendant for years, respected by her colleagues, admired for her professionalism, but in one moment, she had allowed her assumptions and biases to cost her everything. The suspension, the investigation, the hearing, all of it felt like a distant memory now. What remained was the realization of how deeply she had misjudged Ava. Her initial impulse had been to move her to economy, to correct the mistake of a person who didn't fit the mold of a first-class passenger. But now in the quiet aftermath, Miranda could see the depth of her error. Ava wasn't just a regular passenger. She was someone with power, influence, and a deep understanding of the systemic issues that plague the industry. And despite everything that had happened, Ava had handled the situation with calm dignity, never once losing control. Miranda knew that her actions had cost her more than just her job. They had cost her any semblance of self-respect. She had made a snap judgment, acted out of prejudice, and now she was facing the consequences. The hardest part was not the public humiliation, not the loss of her career, but the realization that her actions had hurt someone who hadn't deserved it, and for that, she would have to make amends. It wasn't long before Miranda found herself walking into a small office, her mind filled with uncertainty. After being terminated, she had received an unexpected offer from a nonprofit organization focused on workplace diversity and inclusion. They wanted her to join their team, to use her experience as a case study for change. It was an offer she had never expected, but it also felt like a second chance, one that would allow her to contribute to something bigger than herself. Miranda sat down at the desk, her hands shaking slightly as she read the materials in front of her. It wasn't going to be easy. She knew that her past actions would follow her and that she would have to work hard to prove herself. But the organization was committed to helping individuals like her, people who had made mistakes but were willing to learn, grow, and use their experiences to create positive change. Miranda wasn't sure she was ready, but she knew she had to try. Meanwhile, Ava's life continued to move forward. She had become a prominent voice in the conversations surrounding workplace bias and discrimination. Her efforts had led to a public statement from the airline's board, pledging to implement further reforms in response to the incident. But Ava was careful not to make it about herself. She had no interest in taking credit. Instead, she used her position to bring attention to the larger systemic issues at play, hoping that her actions would inspire others to do the same. One afternoon, as Ava sat in her office reviewing the latest report from the airline, her assistant, Maya, knocked on the door. "Miss Carter," Maya began, her tone cautious. "There's someone here to see you. A Miranda Scott." Ava looked up from her desk, surprised. She hadn't expected to hear from Miranda again. "Send her in," she said, her voice calm but guarded. Miranda entered the room, her posture stiff and uncertain. She looked different, more fragile, less confident than the woman Ava had met on the plane. She stood at the doorway, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Ava stood up from her desk, her eyes meeting Miranda's. There was no anger in her gaze, no judgment, only a quiet understanding. "Please have a seat," Ava said, gesturing toward the chair across from her. Miranda hesitated for a moment before sitting down. She took a deep breath, collecting her thoughts. "I don't know how to begin," she said softly, her voice filled with regret. "I wanted to apologize, Ava, for everything, for how I treated you on the flight, for assuming things about you that weren't true. I acted out of prejudice, and I realize now how wrong I was." Ava listened quietly, her expression neutral but attentive. She had already known this apology was coming, but hearing it still carried weight. It wasn't about receiving an apology. It was about seeing whether Miranda truly understood the gravity of her actions. I've been given a second chance, Miranda continued, her voice cracking slightly, and I'm doing everything I can to learn from my mistakes. I've started working with a nonprofit focused on diversity and inclusion, and I know it won't be easy, but I want to be part of the change. Ava nodded, her expression softening. I believe you, Miranda, she said quietly. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, and it takes even more courage to change. I hope you use this opportunity to grow and make a difference. Miranda's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. Thank you, Ava, she whispered. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful for it. Ava gave her a small, reassuring smile. Forgiveness isn't about deserving it. It's about choosing to move forward, and it looks like you're on the right path. The two women sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their past hanging between them. But as they exchanged quiet words of understanding, something shifted in the air. Ava had never sought revenge. She had only sought accountability. And in that moment, Miranda understood the power of Ava's actions, the power of confronting bias and standing firm for what is right. As the meeting came to a close, Miranda stood up, a sense of resolve settling in her chest. She had much to do, and the road ahead would be difficult. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. Ava had shown her that change was possible, even for those who had made the worst mistakes. As Miranda left Ava's office, she knew that her journey wasn't over. But it was only just beginning, and this time, she would walk it with a new understanding, one that was rooted in humility, growth, and the determination to be a part of something bigger than herself. Ava watched her leave, her heart calm but full. Change had been set in motion, and it was just the beginning. The path ahead was long, but Ava knew that with each step forward, the world was becoming a little bit better, and that was all that mattered. As the weeks passed, both Ava and Miranda continued on their separate journeys, but the impact of the events on Flight 287 lingered in the air, shaping the course of their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. The systemic changes at the airline were well underway, with the implementation of sensitivity and bias training becoming a standard practice for all staff. The board of directors had begun regular reviews of policies, ensuring that future incidents, like the one involving Ava, would be met with swift and thorough action. For Ava, the satisfaction of seeing change unfold was immense, but she was not one to rest on her laurels. She knew that meaningful change took time and persistence, and she remained dedicated to her mission of holding organizations accountable for the injustices they perpetuated. Her efforts had not only sparked a broader conversation within the airline, but also within the larger corporate world. Other companies had reached out to her for guidance, and Ava had become a quiet yet powerful voice for justice and inclusivity. Miranda, on the other hand, found herself in a completely different world now. Her decision to work with a nonprofit organization focusing on diversity and inclusion had been a turning point. Every day, she faced the challenge of confronting her biases, learning from her mistakes, and understanding the deep-rooted structures that perpetuated prejudice. It wasn't easy, and she often felt the weight of her past mistakes bearing down on her. But there was a sense of purpose in her work that had been missing from her previous life as a flight attendant. She worked closely with others who were also trying to change. But what set her apart was the fact that she had lived through the consequences of her own actions. Her experience, painful as it was, became a powerful story for the organization. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a living example of the transformation that could occur when someone was willing to take accountability for their actions. One evening, Ava found herself back at the airport, preparing to board a flight for a business meeting. As she made her way to the gate, she noticed something different. The staff seemed more engaged, their interactions with passengers more genuine. There was a warmth in their demeanor, a patience in their responses. Ava couldn't help but smile to herself. It was small, but it was a sign that the changes she had fought for were beginning to take hold. The culture was slowly shifting. She reached the gate, and as she was about to check in, the agent behind the counter looked up, recognition in her eyes. "Miss Carter, welcome back," the agent said, smiling warmly. "We've upgraded your seat as a token of appreciation for your continued support." Ava smiled but waved the offer off politely. "Thank you, but I'm fine where I am," she said, her voice calm yet confident. As she made her way onto the plane, she passed several flight attendants who had been there during her ordeal. Clara, in particular, who had been kind to her despite the tension. Clara had since been promoted to a senior role, her professionalism recognized and rewarded. Ava caught her eye and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Clara smiled back, a silent understanding passing between them. As the plane took off and the city stretched out beneath her, Ava leaned back in her seat, reflecting on how far she had come. The battles had been difficult, but the progress was undeniable. What had begun as a personal affront had grown into a movement. A movement not just for accountability, but for systemic change. She knew the road ahead wasn't without its challenges, but for the first time, she felt confident that it was a road worth walking. Meanwhile, Miranda was also on a path of change. She had been working hard with a nonprofit, leading workshops, and sharing her story with others. She had taken the lessons from her past and used them to educate herself and others about the dangers of assumptions, prejudice, and bias. It wasn't always easy, and there were days when she felt discouraged, but she knew that the work she was doing was making a difference. She wasn't the same person she had been when she made that fateful decision to move Ava to economy. She was someone who had learned from her mistakes and was now dedicated to making sure those mistakes didn't happen again. In a quiet moment one evening, Miranda sat at her desk, reflecting on how far she had come. She had made mistakes, yes, but she had also found redemption. She had found a way to contribute to the world in a meaningful way. And as she read over the latest report from the nonprofit, one that showed significant improvements in diversity and inclusion policies at various companies, Miranda couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. She had been given a second chance, and now she was determined to make the most of it. The lesson from the story. The story of Ava Carter and Miranda Scott is a powerful reminder that actions have consequences, both for those who make decisions and for those who are impacted by them. It is a story about accountability, change, and the importance of confronting our biases, whether we are in positions of power or not. Ava's calm and strategic response to the injustice she faced on the flight not only led to her personal vindication, but also sparked a broader conversation about systemic issues within the airline industry. She used her voice not for revenge, but for reform. She demonstrated that change begins when we are willing to hold institutions accountable, regardless of their size or power. For Miranda, the story is one of personal growth. She made a mistake, a serious one, and it cost her dearly. But through the painful process of reflection and accountability, she found a new purpose in life. She used her experience to help others understand the importance of diversity and inclusion, and to ensure that the mistakes she made would not be repeated. The lesson is clear. Accountability is the first step toward meaningful change. When we acknowledge our mistakes and work to rectify them, we not only transform ourselves, but also contribute to a larger, positive shift in society. Whether we are the ones who make the mistakes or the ones who are wronged, we each have a role to play in creating a world that values fairness, respect, and understanding. In the end, both Ava and Miranda learned that true power lies in the ability to grow, to learn from our mistakes, and to use our experiences to make a positive impact on the world around us. Their story is a testament to the power of accountability and the idea that even the most difficult moments can lead to growth, redemption, and lasting change.